All right, folks, welcome to Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I am sitting here with one of my greatest friends in my life, Justin Rogers Cooper. We're going to talk a lot about that sort of sentimental, mushy stuff today, so I might as well start with that. Good to see you, Justin.
Nice to see you too. Here we are in our own homosocial utopia.
Is this a homosocial utopia or
It,
is this Iowa?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, David, is this heaven?
right. Um, I mean, sometimes it feels that way. I,
Yeah.
I I look forward to our like condensed 60-minute Friday conversations about the most random topics, but honestly, there's if they're not so random, there's a pattern there. And today we're talking about something that fits into I think a number of episodes we've been doing lately, but also just the wider concept of the nostalgia trap. When I ask people like what are the most nostalgic movies for them, the one we're talking about today is often on the top of the list, and that movie is Field of Dreams. It came out in 1989, directed by a guy called Phil Alden Robinson, who directed a couple other Hollywood movies. But really, it's a film that's, I think, mostly associated with Kevin Costner, the main star. And it's a movie about baseball and magic and a lot of other things. But I just wanted to preface by saying I had never seen this movie before you and I decided to record a conversation about it.
Mm.
And when I told people that, like other friends and people I know, like, oh, I've never seen Field of Dreams, they were like, they acted like it was sacrilege, like I had, offended them or betrayed them in some way. Like, how have you never seen this movie? Because it seems like it's part of the pop culture DNA for a lot of people. And watching it with the eyes of someone who hasn't seen it, uh, and at the age I am, and with all this kind of buildup, it was a different experience. And I think for the people that watch it when they were a teenager and have been watching it with their families for their whole lives, like a lot of people told me, including my friend Peter, who's a friend of the show, talking about like his family visiting the actual site, which is something we can get into as a phenomenon of the film as well. So the film has this massive legacy. What's your relationship to Field of Dreams, Justin?
I remember seeing it as a kid and not really understanding the plot. And I think that the few times I've watched it with Conrad, I'm not totally sure he understands the plot, but I understood the emotional center of the film, which is Kevin Costner and his family, and then Kevin Costner with Terrence Mann, the fictional writer that's played by James Earl Jones, and uh, Costner, whose character's name is Ray Kinsella, his relationship to these ball players. And when I saw it, I had already liked baseball and was probably playing, little league baseball. So the baseball kind of drew me in. But the longer I've thought about this movie, the more I'm struck by something that the author of the book Shoeless Joe, upon which the film is based, whose name is Kinsella, I'm struck by one of the things that he said over and over in his very sort of open, lighthearted attitude towards the construction of the film when he was approached by Phil Alden Robinson. And one
Mm-hmm.
thing he kept saying is, the movie and the book, they're not about baseball. And that triggered me in a way because it's so clearly about baseball, but it's also not. And so that emotional core, it's about fathers and sons. In some ways, it's about being a father and being a son, and Costner has that interesting pivotal role there. But it's also in light of the conversations we've had about Stand by Me and Elliott Smith.
Yeah.
It's an inverse, but a complement to those discussions because in some ways it's a film about repairing masculinity, both through interracial relationships, but also and especially intergenerational relationships. And it's about, setting out one of the theses. It's about what do you do with a hippie boomer dude who's kind of inheriting the legacy of the cowboy, but is a kind of more intuitive, sensitive, sort of emotionally aware man? How do you reconcile that masculinity historically with that kind of gruffer, older, silent, strong, wounded, even traumatized or traumatizing? What do you do with that older white male masculinity that was that Gary Cooper strong and silent type, that unsentimental cowboy, that maybe a little violent cowboy? What do you do to reconcile the evolution of masculinity across the 20th century? How do men still relate and love one another when the codes of what it means to be a man has changed? And so I think that's
All this is in Field of Dreams.
absolutely. I mean, to me, that's actually what the stuff is about. Yeah.
Totally. No, I mean, I see it, and I'm glad you put it that way because that's what I'm trying to get at Kevin Costner about Kevin Costner. I was mentioning this before we got started. Is like, um, I have this particular relationship with Kevin Costner because he graduated from my high school, and he's kind of a local hero. He comes back and does charity events and things like that. And he was around when I was really young, and when Dances with Wolves came out in like 1990 or 91, he was a huge, huge star. And I looked at him as exactly what you're talking about. I'm like a 12-year-old boy at that point, looking at Kevin Costner and thinking this is a celebrated kind of masculinity. And it's funny because it's like a little bit of like you mentioned like the mullet, the hair. Costner had a little bit of like long hair in the back. It's like this is the boomer hippie growing up kind of thing. That was hot in the early 90s. That was the look for the guys that age. I don't know what that means, but there's something like he's retaining a little bit of the counterculture in the back of his hair, something like that. But yeah, Costner was just huge. And I think that the key in a lot of ways, which I think you articulated just now, is like masculinity, and sort of like what kind of man Kevin Costner is. And I guess that's partly a discussion of what kind of star Kevin Costner is, because for better or worse, this is kind of and I know you want to get into this. This is kind of like a Jimmy Stewart type role. This movie is like it's kind of falls into like that Groundhog Day category, or It's a Wonderful Life, the Frank Capra movies, where there's some sort of like magical intervention. It's not like Jesus necessarily, but something is supernatural happening. And it's the supernatural event isn't really the point. It's more the supernatural event puts into relief the like social issues and the human issues that the filmmaker wants to give us. And it seems like you're right. Field of Dreams is a baseball movie. And I mean, if you're a baseball fan, I guess you're connected to it. But it's not just about the sport of baseball. It's like that undercurrent of like the love underneath the baseball. There's a lot to go on. There's a lot to go on there. But this movie, it's funny because the main vein I got from it when watching it for the first time, I wonder what you think. I just was like, good Lord, this is like laying it on thick in terms of its like sentimentalism. But I mean, that's Capra, right? Like there is a kind of melodramatic maudlin thing going on. And that's partly why it's powerful, I guess.
Yeah. And it's also why it was almost not ever made into a film, and why you could argue the majority of the reviews were quite negative for just the reasons that you're describing. It was considered by the sort of newspaper intelligentsia, the movie reviewer. Imagine this, like pre-Rotten Tomatoes,
the liberal elite.
Yeah, the coastal blue state elite.
Yeah, exactly.
It was imagined as schmaltzy and way
corny.
too
corny.
I mean,
yeah,
kitschy, campy. It was all those things, and it's worth pointing out that it took years to get made, and I think maybe it was 20th Century Fox was first approached through it and sort of was on board, and then I think later it gets made by Universal, and the sort of vox populi, like the popular cultural response to the film, was the inverse of the reviews and of the corporate skepticism about the film's financial potential. And so it was an instant hit. And like in $89, it grossed 64 million bucks, but in today's dollars, you multiply that by 2.55 or thereabouts. So you can see it earned 130, 140 million dollars in 2023, which would have put it as a competent film. And it's not Barbie or Oppenheimer, but it's way above the Marvels. You know what I mean? So like
Right.
it's not a dud. And they released it, I believe, during the summer or something. It was like kind of in the late summer or something like this. But one of the things that marked it, so it's actually released in April, but it's playing in certain theaters until December. So this
Mm.
was a film that
Sleeper.
just
Yeah.
made a ton of money, spread by word of mouth. The audience went to see it despite the reviews. And so when all the stuff that you're talking about in terms of its like kitsch corniness, which turns a lot of people off, probably for good reason. I mean, at the level of the brain, at the level of like a college
You're
degree,
rolling your
what
eyes.
what
Yeah.
the fuck is going on here? But once you look at it as this spectacle of mass art, it forces you to try to figure out, well, what is it that people were paying for? And take the words of Terrence Mann, it's money they have, but peace they lack. That describes the audience for the film, and not just the people who showed up to the baseball diamond at the end of the movie.
Right.
And so it's interesting. It's money they have, that's peace they lack. And so I think that provides a window into us maybe just quickly unpacking what the story is, and then trying to figure out from some of the scenes and some of the patterns we see developing, what the fuck it is. And maybe if we have time, like we can digress into like what the fuck baseball is. But actually that's not even at the top of my list. It's more like it's the Van Santness of
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
characters, of the men, of the dudes in the story, that's like at the front and center here.
Yeah. I mean, it's another boys movie, right? And yeah, I'm glad you said Van Santness. I hadn't really thought of it that way. But the story is, when I was before if you had asked me like 3 weeks ago what Field of Dreams is about, I would have said I think it's about like some ghosts that play
Yeah,
baseball. Like
yeah, that's pretty good.
ghosts, yeah, ghosts that play baseball. Which it would be like the elevator pitch. But no, it's a film about a guy that Kevin Costner plays, is like he wants to do something with his life. But he's out living in this farm in Iowa, with his wife. They don't have kids, right? Are there?
They have a daughter, Karen, the girl who
That's
plays a
right.
pivotal role
Oh,
at the
she's the
end.
one that falls at the end. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, the basic outline of the story is that he hears a voice, and the voice is saying, "If you build it, he will come." And it's like this supernatural intervention in his life, and he keeps hearing this voice. And he thinks he's losing his mind as he hears this voice out in the field. Somehow he deduces that he's supposed to build a baseball field. There's a lot of there's a lot of these like dreams, like there's a dream that him and his wife share, that he should go to a baseball game with this character Terrence Mann, played by James Earl
Fenway.
Jones. Yeah, at Fenway. And as the plot progresses, it's sort of clear that there are sort of like pains in the past that these men share that have to do with the 60s. And that's partly what, like, obviously I think a lot about the 60s and the Vietnam War, and particularly, the kind of like divisions in American society. I had no clue that this movie was in part going to be about like somehow healing the wounds of the 60s, because what I won't we don't need to go far into detail of the plot, but the basic idea is that Kevin Costner and his father had a split about the 60s, and particularly about Costner's like attachment to this author, this like kind of black radical author, I guess, is James Earl Jones' character.
Yeah,
Um,
and about it, and Shoeless Joe, whether he cheated or not, becomes also this like analog for their conflict.
right. So, the central like pain in the screenplay that needs to be healed, is this split with Costner and his father, and it's over the 1960s, and it's over baseball, and it's something that is kind of written out through the rest of the movie, as we watch these baseball players emerge from the cornfields that only what Costner and his wife can see, because they're like in on and James Earl Jones, I guess, can see them too. The
And
people
the
that,
daughter, Karen. Yeah.
yeah, it's like the people that believe, right?
Yep.
And they watch this fucking baseball game.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the movie, now, I mean, people, I don't feel like I'm spoiling it, because it's almost 40
Yeah.
years old at
Everyone's
this
seen it.
point.
Yeah. It's good to
Yeah,
rehearse though. It's nice to hear what you're latching onto.
right. To me, the thing that gets me is the father sort of returns at the end, what is striking to me and kind of tripped me out is the father like doesn't know who he is, kind of. He doesn't understand that he is Costner's father, but Costner understands that this is his dad. And they sort of have this odd exchange, and it's sort of like this guy that I was like, dude, I'm thinking about all the like science fiction implications of this and all this sort
Yeah.
of like mind bending physics of it. I'm like, wait a second, this guy's like caught in between worlds. He's wearing a fucking baseball uniform. There's something haunting about it, actually. To me, the idea of like
Yeah.
caught in the liminal zone, not knowing if you're dead or alive, is sort of a nightmare scenario to me, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
So as he walks away, Costner says, "Hey, Dad, you want to have a catch?" And that's the money shot moment of the film, in which you get a little bit of Costner tearing up for the first time in the movie. For a sentimental movie, it's kind of odd that he doesn't cry until that moment, right? And I know you've made a lot of that in Good Will Hunting too. That kind of like it's not your fault moment. But like
Mm-hmm.
we're building up. These men are jerking each other off until the kind of explosion of tears at the
Yep.
end of the film, right? And that's what you're given at the end is a sort of like the satisfaction of closing that gap in sort of understanding between father and son. And so yeah, it really ends up being like a very Hallmark sort of movie in a way. And I say that just to make one more point. You mentioned the sort of liberal elite critics who sneer at movies like this while people go fucking eat it up. And I feel like that, I mean, that's culture war shit, obviously, but it's present with Costner still with Yellowstone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like no fucking New Yorker article about Yellowstone. They don't give a fuck about that shit. But Yellowstone is like a huge popular program, right? And it is a kind of bit of like this cowboy masculinity still.
Mm-hmm.
So like that Costner has become even more, I think, a character that's like beloved by a certain streak of American population that aren't the like liberal elite. It's the same thing with like when they finally give out the numbers for Netflix of what people are actually watching. We finally get to find out. And the number one thing is Gilmore Girls. Like people are just streaming Gilmore Girls again and again and again. That's a show that isn't on the list with like The Wire or Sopranos or Succession or any of these other prestige shows. Gilmore Girls is just a fucking simple show about a single mom and her daughter in a small town. And yet it's just hits with a certain population. So I think that's part of what I wanted to throw in here too.
I think that's all really well said. And, I think, there are larger structures in play like nation and whiteness and masculinity, but there's also kind of universal desires in play, which, as troubling as it may seem, given certain subject matter and certain individuals, there is something like, in quotes, a universal longing for reparation and for innocence and for repair. And people seek out narratives that, in some cases, enact wish fulfillments that soothe them to sleep and soothe hard memories and provide an escape from various kinds of unfinished relationships or lingering pain. And that's what Smith was singing about too. So that in a weird way, despite the vastly different texture of the subject matter of something like Good Will Hunting or Miss Misery, the longing for peace and also the kind of need to identify with people who are attempting to find security in each other, attempting to find relationships of love. Those attempts are what all three texts have in common, Stand By Me included. And as you said, within all of them, it's the kind of male sharing of tears, or it's the actions that inspire tears that provide a kind of relationship glue that connects the people who are watching the film together in that space in that same time period. Like if you watch the film with your dad, Costner and his dad might just be playing catch and not bawling like little babies. But when I watch it, and think of my dad or think of Conrad, I am crying. And so the film is able to sort of provide this focalization of the like a map of a relationship, whether the relationship is matching the fantasy or not. And I
Mm,
want to speak to one more thing that you
yeah.
just said as a way to kind of maybe open up some of the other directions of the film. And so you mentioned genre, and yeah, this is not only a sentimental cowboy character in some ways, as we've been saying, but as you said, this is science fiction. It's a science fiction movie. It's it's as a genre, you might even call it science fiction realism. It's spiritualized fiction. One other thing that Kinsella, the guy who wrote Shoeless Joe, said that I thought really caught my attention along those lines was he said, I think in order to write of the fantastical, meaning the genre of the fantastic, I think in order to write of the fantastical, you have to have an extraordinary grip on reality. I thought that was really good. And what it reminded me was after the Civil War, when spiritualism and seances took off,
Yeah.
and in cities like New York, people would gather in the brownstones and shut all the curtains and invite a medium to come and let them talk to the dead. And that people like William James, the psychologist and Harvard philosophy professor, were intensely interested in ghosts and the paranormal. And without going down the deep end of a missing 411, of which this conversation is the inverted story of missing 411, like what happens when they return, not what happens when you're searching for them. But
Right.
with that baggage intact, you can see
Found
that
411.
yeah, that one of the big residues, cultural residues of the late 19th century was what do you do with all the missing men of the Civil War and their families and their partners and their friends turned to the paranormal as a way to try to access them, as a way to try to bring them back. And I think that the reason I'm bringing that up is because even though it was occurring within a certain kind of at that point Protestant Catholic, Christian culture, the spiritualizations that were being written about and put into literary form at that time, of which there were tons of best-selling books that also took up that project, they were secular in nature. So what do you do with this kind of, a society that includes secular liberals who might not identify as Christians, but who nonetheless need spiritualized fictions to try to provide the emotional maps in order for them to reconcile some of the pains of their lives? Because
Yeah.
religion normally provides that. The minister, the priest, the church, the mass, the community usually is a way to attempt to heal wounded individuals within the group. But if you don't belong to a religious institution, the film, the movie theater, the story, the spiritualized fiction ends up becoming a sort of method of tapping into what could be near universal human needs for people that don't belong to religious institutions, if that makes sense.
Not only does that make sense to me, that is like a key to understanding everywhere we are. Because, and what I mean by that is that moment after the Civil War that you describe, where people are going into rooms and having seances and lighting candles, that phenomenon, it's not seamless, but there is a direct line from that into the age of cinema. And so, in other words, like the getting into the dark room and turning the lights on and experiencing, and people associated cinema with like ghosts and sort of supernatural energy and stuff like that. So the idea of the Civil War like cleaving like belief in God and then sending it onto screens, and God being on the screen then all the way until we have it in our pocket and we're talking to each other on a screen right now. To me, there's a lot to mine there, obviously, and it's not a like one-to-one. That's just the story of humanity. But there's something really spooky about it because it's sort of like, yeah, a mass religion was born in the late 19th and early 20th century, and that mass religion is pop culture, delivered via industrially produced machines that deliver material that at first is very concerned with ghosts and the dead and hauntings and things like that. And that has continued, that obsession has continued to the point where, you and I are sitting here talking about Field of Dreams in 1989, 100 years after the birth of cinema, more or less. And what is it? It's a movie, a secular religious movie, about hauntings and coming to terms with a war in the past. like literally. I mean, the Vietnam War is exactly 100 years after the Civil War, and it has a very similar effect. You see, after the Vietnam War, you also see a sort of birth of a new spirituality, different types of religions being born.
Beat generation.
Yeah. And all that like spooky new age shit that was born out of the counterculture. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's a lot of lines there. I think it's interesting because the Field of Dreams is such, on the surface, yeah, this kind of hokey sentimental story. At the same time, it works and it's so huge because it seems like it taps into a lot of that stuff. A lot of that. I feel like there's something key there about like the person that doesn't go to church but has religion. Because you sent me some really chilling screenshots this week about evangelical Christianity in the United States, sort of the people who don't go to church but are super conservative Trump people. And it was kind of like the replacement of Trump with Jesus among a certain type of people who describe themselves as Christians in America. And that to me was interesting and goes along with this. The sort of like the lines between Christianity and a sort of like I don't know, a sort of secular fascism or something.
It is interesting as an aside that some of the, I think it was a New York Times article, I can't remember though, that said that some of Trump's most ardent supporters are people that identify as evangelicals but who don't go to church. I think that's a
Right.
really interesting that's an interesting topic and one we can hold on to for our 2024
They
extravaganza.
don't go to church,
Um,
but I bet they watch movies, and I bet they watch, I bet they're
yeah,
like, in pop
I,
culture.
I definitely watch TikTok. I can tell you that.
And
And
yeah, yeah, and Yellowstone maybe too.
yeah, and another thing that you brought up that I think is really important is I think because of that scene where I think Ray, Kevin Costner's wife, Annie, is at the like school board meeting where they're talking about banning books for sexuality, including one of Terrence Mann's books. This kind of fictional J.D. Salinger writer who, to me, actually comes off a lot like Baldwin, whose role in the '60s and then kind of eclipse in the late '60s and kind of washout status. To me, that's I can map that onto the Terrence Mann figure a little bit,
Totally.
maybe
Yeah.
not fully.
Also, the
But
book banning thing. I mean, it's very MAGA.
yeah, I was glad that she brought up Stalin because those MAGA people are such anti-communists, but they share so many communist police state values. And sorry out there, tankies. And the reason I also think that the Vietnam is like this subtext that's not spoken is because you get almost every other signifier of the counterculture. At one point, Annie early in the film mentions the acid flashback to the acid flash forward, which I think is an underdeveloped idea from the film that I want to think about more in the future. The flash forward acid, and
I'm also imagining watching this film on acid or psychedelics and just being like, what the fuck
yeah,
is this? This is like,
might make more sense. Yeah,
I would probably think this is probably the most important film ever made.
yeah.
It's the key to understanding fucking everything.
Well, because look, the ghosts and the paranormal aspects of it contain elements of hallucinations. So it's almost like a book or a text that inherited some of the '60s acid trips, in addition to like the fairy tale elements. But it's interesting that Vietnam is what's not named because almost every other countercultural signifier is put into play, including the civil rights movement, which is interesting. And the period in question that we reverted back to in the late 19th century, I think, is also worth noting because a book came out of that era that later gets developed into like a surprise hit, I believe. And if you turn to one of the people who talks about that connection, it's none other than Oliver Stone, who we also associate with countercultural films. And when he was asked about Field of Dreams, here's like a big Hollywood director at the time in the '90s being asked about this schmaltzy movie.
Right.
And someone who's not considered a sentimentalist said he loved the film. And when he was asked why, he said it evokes the Wizard of Oz. And I thought that was an interesting text to throw up there to the Capra film of It's a Wonderful Life. because of the magical, fantastic elements we're describing that also seem grounded in what Kinsella, the Shoeless Joe author, calls the absolute grounding in realism. That the science fiction texts that are sometimes the most effective are the ones that have the least science in them, but the most sort of paranormal plot twists. And Wizard of
People
Oz
call that
definitely.
magical realism too, right?
It
Yeah.
is. It
Yeah.
could easily be a magical realist text. And, as we get kind of maybe a edge closer to some of these relationships, these male relationships in the um in the in the movie, I just wanted to throw one other thing out there that I think sets the table in case we don't return to it. And people have tried to connect the sort of secular mysticism of the genre and the plot points with baseball. And
Hmm.
so it is worth noting that there's a long fictional and non-fictional literature thinking about baseball's relationship to church and to
Sure. Yeah.
the sacred and the profane. And just to take one representation of that kind of stands in for all of it, uh, Bart Giamatti, one of the old romantic baseball commissioners back in the late 20th century, he was I think, commissioner when I was coming up as a kid, argued, quote, I agree with the argument that sports can be viewed as a kind of popular or debased religion in the sense that the most intense feelings are brought to bear, or in the sense that sports may mirror whatever avowedly sacred concerns Americans do share. And then he continues, and this is my last little point here. If there is a truly religious quality to sport, then it lies first in the intensity of devotion brought by the true believer or fan, and it consists second or more so in the widely shared binding nature, the creed-like quality of American sport.
Hmm.
And to that, I would just only add that there are gendered and raced elements to that discussion. It might not be as sort of universal as we think it is, but maybe it works. Maybe there's some part of that is kind of if not universal, then hegemonic. It's a majoritarian part of the culture.
It's another one of those things like sports that is sneered at by the liberal elite, right? Like, I mean, baseball is, I think, with an exception in some ways to that. Like, there's kind of like this like old New York Times reporter, like urban thing with baseball. But football and things like that. I mean, MMA, those sorts of things. Like that. I remember like Noam Chomsky, one of the in one of those documentaries, him talking about sports and me kind of like cringing at what he was saying because he was saying, well, the popularity of sports is just because that's capitalists want to keep people busy looking at stuff that doesn't matter. And I was kind of like, what? Like that to me, the kind of top down, like that the people are just given this pablum of sports just to keep them busy so they don't notice their human batteries like the Matrix doesn't really ring true with like my experience of sports and people's relationship with it, honestly. Like Chomsky's just like, I'm like, what the fuck, dude? He's bad on like pop culture and sports and religion and shit like that.
Yeah, it's an oversimplification. I'm sure some element of it is true. It's the whole bread and circuses argument taken to an extreme from the Roman Empire.
Right.
It's like the whole thing is just a spectacle of death. And then you have the
I
Carlin
don't watch
take.
sports.
Yeah, you have the
I read important things.
yeah, and then you have the Carlin take, which in his stand-up that we shared last month was kind of comparing football to baseball, and that has its own analysis. Tracking into it, sports is like a whole nother conversation, and I think the minimum thing we can say here is that this movie taps into some of the reasons why any like kind of savage economic first analysis of it is just kind of wildly unable to explain its power. And it's also worth noting that it's not like the United States or the Roman Empire were the only societies that uh, had sports as like a major center of the society. Sports are common to like the anthropological study of almost all cultures that have ever existed.
Yeah,
Like,
competitive
yeah,
games. Yeah,
competitive games is actually like a really interesting scholarly topic. You can,
totally.
there are books and books and books on this. So the idea of reducing it down to like not only not the bare bones, but even one bone, it's
Yeah.
just it doesn't have much explanatory power.
Well, and Field of Dreams itself as much of it as a sports movie, the sports part of it is probably one of the lowest. Honestly, it doesn't deliver as a sports movie in the way that maybe I don't know, maybe it's a bad example, but like Rocky,
Sure.
But like I
Or
say that
Rudy.
that's a bad example because when you watch Rocky, I'm like, where's the fucking boxing? This whole thing's just about some sad dude, like, and his sad girlfriend, and then like
Yeah.
you get some boxing finally. But yeah, I mean the
Good call, but that makes
yeah,
sense. Yeah.
I mean they're good metaphors, right? I mean, and baseball here, I'm trying to think of like the wider history of you mentioned baseball and football, but like there's some there's some association with baseball with like a previous era that like baseball is nostalgic, right? Like it feels like the era of baseball we're in now is very, very different than the kind of romantic vision of baseball that even Field of Dreams is playing with. And like I don't know who put forth this theory. I saw it somewhere, but I mean it makes sense that like baseball's sort of decline as the national sport and the rise of the NFL that happens in the 70s and 80s mirrors the decline of cities and the rise of the suburbs. And it's like sort of like urban community sport of baseball, and then the kind of like we watch football on TV in the suburbs and grill in the backyard. And I know that's kind of like a broad sort of analysis, but I feel like that there's something going on there with kind of like longing for a previous era contains baseball often as a part of it, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could talk about it the rest of the show. A couple things just off the top of my head, and then I want to take it into a couple scenes from the film.
Go for it,
Is
man.
that one, baseball is interesting because it's that pastoral, agricultural field in a city. So all the people that have migrated to the urban center from regions of the world, Europe, North America, anywhere, who have come into the city to find work and to find jobs, they already encounter the film as a nostalgic space in that it resembles the countryside they've left in search of for work. So it's manufactured, you know, as a product, maybe not in its origins during and after the Civil War, but it's manufactured as a business product for urban people who probably are taking trains and trolleys to work or walking and lack access to the countryside. And so that's one of its kind of appeals from the very beginning. And the other flip side of it is it's often seen as this kind of like 19th century representation of agricultural economy because it's got this big field and people are playing in the field. It's a child's game in a way that isn't often associated with basketball and football, at least not in the kind of legacy sense. But it was a game that was like picked up by kids, sticks and rocks, and they're running around. And so it has qualities that can contain both the sort of 19th century economic origins that it purportedly has, and it was also supposed to entertain not just a geographic but a temporal landscape of nostalgia. So it's not just the place we came from where the kids are playing, but you might even think to yourself, oh, I remember playing in a field like that as
Right.
well.
Yeah.
Just setting aside the whole contradiction in my argument of like street ball and everything, which is for another day.
Well, the
um
field thing too, just to pause, is
mhm,
is Wizard of Oz too, right? Like the kind of like that pastoral, like that vision of where Dorothy lives at the beginning of Wizard of Oz is the farm, right? It's like it's already, and I mean, when that film was made in the what late 1930s, I think that film came out in
mhm,
1939.
mhm,
How urban was the country? How pastoral and nostalgic a vision was that already?
mhm.
I mean, I'm reading this book, Engines of Change. It's all about the evolution of automobiles, and it mentions the Model T being discontinued in 1927, and it was in part discontinued because it was a recognition that like this was a farmer's car, and the country was rapidly urbanizing, and that style was going away. And I mean that's a cultural shift as much as it is an economic one and a real one, etc. But it feels like by 1939, people can watch Wizard of Oz and be fantasizing about the farm that she's in, and it feels like that cornfield that Dorothy emerges from or occupies is the same cornfield that Kevin Costner's playing baseball in with Ghosts in 1989.
Yeah, that's good. That must be one of the foundation of Stone's comment, which
Right.
I hadn't thought of that. So that makes a ton of sense. The other thing that I just want to say about baseball is to layer my own little my own little step here, is that football, as Carlin says in his stand-up bit, is a game in which the offense takes on aerial qualities, and so that when the quarterback throws the ball through the air, it's like an air force, and then you have a ground game, which is like the tanks, and it's a much more militaristic metaphor of a game, but it's a militaristic metaphor that is post-flight, post Wright brothers. It's a game that you can easily see emerging out of World War II in a way that baseball you can more easily see emerging out of the Civil War. And one of the things that Carlin does in that bit is that he kind of makes baseball into like, we're going to play at the park. And then he takes it on the deeper masculine voice. He's like, football is a war. That's the whole basis of the bit.
Yes.
But he misses something about baseball that I would just like to add, which is that to me, it's kind of in its agricultural origins. Baseball is also, to me, more about the transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy. And so when you look at the lonely farmer in some of those 19th century novels like Willa Cather, et cetera, it's like the homestead where like the single farmer has all these kids that are trying to like grow this crop and raise it on their own. And I'm bringing that up because it's at the root. It's a settler fantasy that's about the individual in the homestead. And it's like a family farm is the kind of model. And it's way before agribusiness. And the reason I'm stressing this is because it's not a collectivized model. But when you look to the industrialization that's happening in the United States at the time, especially urban industrialization, all of a sudden you start to see businesses that rely on teams of people to create markets and profits, and everyone has to play this role. And so that the only way to run like a small business, a craft business, or even a factory is to have everybody doing their job. And so baseball to me looks less like a war metaphor game and more like an economic metaphor game, but it's not just agricultural, it's agricultural / industrial. It's about a transition from a farm to an industrial economy. And it's interesting
that's what Wizard of Oz is about too.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it happens after the Civil War because there's nothing to me that's that much of the plantation about it. It's Jim Crow codes aside for a second. And to take it one step further, what Carlin misses by saying it's like a little like we're at the park, whee! The thing that he misses there is, to me, baseball often ends up being a representation of capitalism in addition to being like an actual business that tries to make money by selling tickets. And by that, I mean like the idea of competing against another team to see who can have the most runs, who can have the most efficient business, who can contain the competition, who can have the most sales or runs or capital, who can accumulate the most capital in a certain amount of time. Those kinds of elements to me strongly suggest that it's about sort of naturalizing capitalist attitudes at a time in society in which men were becoming businessmen, not just farmers. That to me is part of it. So that leads into the film, because then what you're really talking about when you're talking about Field of Dreams and baseball is you're talking about a certain nostalgic vision of labor and a certain nostalgic vision of labor practices. And one of the things that comes up isn't just the fact that Ray's father, John Kinsella, never got to play. He made it to the minors, but he never gets to the major leagues. Or Doc Graham, Moonlight Graham, the guy who plays a half inning, but he never gets an at bat. Those two guys also have their wishes fulfilled through this fantasy. And it's a fantasy about playing a game, but it's also it's a fantasy about work. And this is the nostalgia trap part of it that really hits to me, and then kind of one of the more superficial but also less obvious aspects of the film. It's a film about men working together, not just fathers and sons. It's about the opportunity to have unalienated work. Because if you look at to see what Shoeless Joe says early on when the movie has its initial sentimental scenes where you can hear it in the James Horner score, the cool synthesizer music, which I thought is an excellent part of the film. He says, they pushed me out of this game. I wanted to play this game. I would have played for nothing. And that idea where they just want to work at something that they love. They want to work at something that they enjoy. They don't want any distance between what they're doing to live and the kind of imposition that they're doing it simply to get by. They're not selling their labor power. It's a socialist utopia is what they're actually looking for. It's a socialist utopia within capitalist competition. That's what they're looking for. And in that utopia, it's not just that I'm not alienated at the factory or the office. It's that I'm doing this thing that I love, and it doesn't even feel like work. It feels like play. It's not just that. It's that while I do it, It's my relationship to my other workers is seamless. We're all out here having fun, supporting each other. And it's through the work that we create fraternity, and through the work that we create this brotherhood of unalienated laborers. And so what baseball stages on the field isn't just this reconciliation of masculinities across time and across generations. What it's staging and what it's rehearsing in this movie, but also arguably as a product, is that over and over and over again, the thing you want to participate in when you scream and you cheer for that moment, the thing you want to become a part of with this labor, with this playful, unalienated labor, the thing that you most want is to become part of a composition, part of an institution, part of a corporation in which there's no daylight between the thing that you do for a living and the thing that you do for money. And that also just obliterates, I think, part of the romance that's at stake here.
Yeah, that's really well said. I mean, it makes me think of like do what you love and the money will follow. But a lot of that's like a bitter thing for a lot of people because it doesn't seem real, right? It's like, what does that even mean? Do what you love and the money will follow. There's a belief though, and that maybe that's a magical religious belief that can be achieved, that I could achieve the perfect harmony. I mean, so I just saw you see these commercials now for OnlyFans. OnlyFans, which is like I always thought of it as like this is where people like basically post nude pictures of themselves and sell them.
Yeah.
But it's become more than that. It's like a little like Patreon now. Even though it's like there's still a lot of porn on there and that sort of thing. People are selling their body. But anyway, the commercials for them are very high gloss commercials. And they're like people saying, basically, I'm unalienated labor. They're saying, I used to work a job, but now, like only because I have an OnlyFans account and I went viral, I'm free and I have time. And this girl in the commercial is like hiking in the woods with her dog, and she's like, everybody should have this much time, free time. But he's basically saying like I've been liberated, and I hope other people can too. Go to OnlyFans and start your account, and maybe you can be unalienated labor as well. Isn't that like the I'm my own boss, small business guy, the entrepreneur, the like? I don't know. You can fool yourself, I think, into believing that you're not alienated in some way. And I think it's something to point out about Field of Dreams is that these guys only achieve this in death. They're ghosts, right? Like they're liberated in part because they've been reduced to that pure essence of they're just baseball players. I mean, there's something silly about it, and there's something really mind-bending about it at the same time because they are not human beings. They're dead people that are back in some spiritual form, and all they want is just that experience. It's sort of like it reminds me of the zombies that return to the shopping mall because it's like they remember that's not they're like that was the most important place in their lives, like that sort of thing. I think that joke is made like in Dawn of the Dead in the 70s. They were making that joke, but like either way, that's sort of like I don't know. It makes me think that there's like as much as people like you and I and, Marxist academics talk about capitalism as just this pure evil. And I don't think we generally talk about it that way, you and I, but I think you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, there's this sort of like, I think I'm always marveling at how much people believe in it. Like, how can you believe in this? It's just bullshit. Like, they're just stealing from you. Like, look at what Marx said. At the same time, it's like people are like, yeah, but get out of the way. I'm building my own business. I have an OnlyFans account.
Right.
Like, in other words, and while we sit here being like, how can you believe in that? It's sort of like Chomsky being like, how can you like sports? You must be a moron. It's just propaganda to keep you distracted. You're kind of missing something. You're missing that like people need what people need, I guess. And whatever we call capitalism delivers for them. The most important thing of it might be this like faith, like a faith that they could achieve that too. And as much as people tear their hair out and be like, it's never going to happen for you, you can't live your life thinking it's never going to happen.
Yep.
You have to keep on trucking. And I think I tweeted earlier this week that like, because I think it was this hobbled me when I was younger, honestly, in some ways. Is like waiting for capitalism to collapse. You're gonna be waiting your whole life.
Yeah.
And it's not like knowing that capitalism is a structure that oppresses the masses across the world, even you and I, in some way, doesn't help you pay your bills. And that part of it, I think, is a rough pill for like left people, especially like young idealistic leftists in America, I'm talking about, to try to sort of reconcile as they get older and realize that like you have to play this game one way or the other. And I don't know. It's something that is, I think, a fundamental contradiction that I think about a lot.
And part that's so well articulated because those last few sentences you just spoke was Ray Kinsella's journey to reconciling with his father.
Yeah.
That you have to play this game. So in the movie, that's baseball, but for you, it's capitalism. And Ray Kinsella is the idealistic hippie who breaks with his dad because he perceives his dad to be corrupt for loving a man that he thinks might have been cheating, but maybe who wasn't. But it's in a way, it's about how do you reconcile your faith in institutions when the institutions are corrupt. And part of what the movie's proposal there is that you can accomplish this through familial relationships. Now, that might not be true either, but it might be true enough. That's either way, it's a point of contradiction and it's a point of friction that
And hey, dude, think about the Republican Party just
investigating.
being family, family, family,
Right,
family, family. You know, and in this era, like in this
right,
1989 era, that's at its height.
right. And so that avenue of how can stories about families uh, compress and refract and reconcile by shrinking and miniaturizing these more global abstract tectonic divisions. And that's part of the reason why we have shows and stories, is that in the relationships between characters like fathers and sons, you have the burden of representation in which you can see a mass conflict playing itself out at the emotional level. And one thing we've always done on this show is we've always paid attention to the individual, quote unquote, acknowledging there's tons of different kinds of them. But that attention to the cell within the tissue, I think is very important for understanding how capitalism reproduces itself ideologically in ways that a straightforward Marxist critique often loses. And that's the basis of our entire queer Marx paradigm. What I also, what jumped out at me in terms of what you're saying is that the kind of capitalist economic fantasy, the American dream fantasy, the logic of dreams, in which the whole science fiction realism of this film unfolds, is contrasted to the we're going to mortgage the farm, we're going to lose the farm, we're going to lose the house, we'll let you keep the house, but we're going to take your crop. The bankers are the bad guys. And that bankers being the bad guys has that echo, not just of Wizard of Oz, but back to It's a Wonderful Life. It's got that Capra-esque middle class gumption behind it, in which in It's a Wonderful Life, the enemy is the banker who's foreclosing on the house. And once again, in Field of Dreams, the enemy is the banker who's foreclosing on the farm / the house. And so this
And isn't Wizard of Oz some sort of like Gilded Age metaphor for like William Jennings Bryan and like the silver standard versus the gold standard? I think that's what that movie
right,
is about.
but it's also about how does the macroeconomic landscape play on our house. Look at the tornado disrupting the house. So it's like the home that is supposed to be the center of gravity for the American dream in ways that we all know through the stereotypes. That's the thing that's being threatened. And yet the rescue plan, is coming through some dreamlike vision. The dreamlike vision may be OnlyFans in 2024 through the dreamlike quality of swiping up and swiping back and swiping down and charging your credit card. But the dreamlike quality of the film is the dreamlike seance of film itself as a medium, which is working to do all this. And so I think that once we spin all that back to like this economic labor utopia thing that's at the center of it, you can start to see that the film is powerful in part because all these layers are working at once. And so that it's not just about a son and a father being redeemed. It's about workers nostalgic for a period in which they could have found unalienated lives. And so to take the last example there, there's a few emotional climaxes of the film, of which the "Wanna Have a Catch" is sort of the cinching crescendo of the film's sentimental symphony. But part of what happens right before that is when Ray, Annie, and Karen are with Ray's brother-in-law or whatever, who's trying to take the house back and finally sees the game. And what allows him to believe is when Karen chokes on the hot dog.
Yeah.
And that's the beginning of the tears. The tears start there and then end with the father. And if you analyze when the tears flow and when they end, that hydraulic road is the ideological map of the film's emotional resonances. And so Doc Graham got his at bat. Moonlight Doc Graham, hit a sack fly with Shoeless Joe on the team. And even that chokes me up. And he sees the choking child,
Yeah.
and he steps across the white line and becomes the old man again. And feels so grateful, and he feels such gratitude. And those aren't words that we associate with the kind of father-son redemption story, but that gratefulness is reciprocated when he pops the hot dog out of Karen's throat.
Yep.
And so the family is saved through the reciprocity and gratitude of the magic doctor, who is only there because he's emerged from the dream of a socialist utopia. So if you look at all that at once, part of what you start to see is that the key word that hasn't been stated, is something like gratitude or recognition for having done the good work in life. And so when he goes back into the cornfield, the players, Shoeless Joe, I believe, says to him before he disappears, he goes, "Hey, rookie, you were good."
Yeah, right.
And that line captures this wish for innocence, this wish that you can have it all, that the dream can come true. But also the dream that's coming true is this paternal inversion where the person you want to be told you did good, aside from St. Peter at the pearly gates or whatever, is your spouse, your child, your father, your mother, the people who you love the most. You want to be seen as good in their eyes. And that's a childhood wish. That's making your parents proud, making yourself proud. And at that point that we've reached that, you can see that, again, it's beyond economic fantasy, beyond dream fantasy, beyond father-son redemption. It's the deepest, most eternal longing that people have, is just to be considered that they led a life of honor.
Yeah.
And it's about death, and it's about dying. And so, we've accessed almost everything here in terms of its spiritualized fictional dimensions. But it's worth just stressing one more time that if this is a secular religious text, that, like all secular religious texts, part of the work that it has to do is to comfort us that the choices we've made will honor the elders that have preceded us into the great beyond.
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, it's making me think of the moment that really surprised me with how deeply it resonated with me in the latest season of White Lotus, with F. Murray Abraham, who is sort of an older dude, and he has a sort of devastating moment where he doesn't connect with the family members he thought he was going to. And he realizes he's alone, and he says something like, "I thought that there would be a woman with me when I died to tell me that I did a good job." And I was just like, something about that just ruined me, to hear an old guy say that, dude. It's just like, good Lord. It's so sad. But yeah, that the one thing that I wanted to sort of end with here, that maybe wraps it all up, is that, what we're talking about is sort of like, I mean, part of the things that's going to resonate with me from this conversation is this sort of like, knowing you're being manipulated, but still subsuming yourself to the illusion because you need it. And it's sort of like watching those final plot moves that you describe in Field of Dreams. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so being manipulated here. I can see the strings of the puppet master. And yet, there's sort of like an idea. It's like the guy in the Matrix who's like, I don't care, give me the steak, right? Like, even knowing it's fake, I don't care because the illusion is so good. I need it. And I mean, that's what Wizard of Oz touches on too. They see the wizard, right? Like they see the man behind the curtain. But the illusion of Oz is still a real thing. And that part of it, I think, is it kind of keys into what we're talking about with sort of, I don't know, seeing behind the curtain in part can be a metaphor for like learning about the structures of capitalism, right? Like I learned about the structures of capitalism. I see how it all operates. I see a lot of people saying this. So, like once I heard about the like Marxist theory of like value and fetish objects, I can't see the world not like that. I'm like, and
Right.
I'm basically stuck every time I think about my phone or anything. I'm kind of seeing these objects as just totems that represent all of these relations and all of these like labor relations and relations of value and things like that. And like, yeah, that you're seeing the strings of the puppet master, you're seeing Oz, but you still got to live in Oz. And I don't know, I've just been thinking a lot about that, in part because I know there is like a, you see it especially on TikTok and like everywhere else. There are young people that are very much, attached to they've seen the strings, that sort of thing, and they're like kind of can't get over that. And I'm just wondering like what the function of all of that is, and how it actually allows you to sort of exist in the world as a happy person pursuing a life that does sort of intermix with capitalist values, and making the best of it. Is this like becoming like a pragmatic older person? I think you know what I'm describing though.
Well, we are aging, and it's we're different
You only
guys
have so
than
much time. You know what I mean? Like I think that's part of it.
yeah. Well, I think that we're showing our weaknesses, and at the same time, I think we're stating problems that actually, you know, a lot of us wrestle with in just these ways, just articulated, and
I still want to cut the strings of the puppet master. Don't get me wrong. You know what I mean? I still am
I get it.
troubled by all of that.
I get it.
I think part of it is my own sort of internal resistance to films like Field of Dreams and being like, especially as a younger person, just kind of dismissing that shit, almost being like Chomsky, like about sports, being like, anyone who's into that is fucking stupid. Like you're just like buying into some Hollywood bullshit. But then like being older and sort of like looking at it in the way you and I have looked at it now, um, I don't know. I kind of recognize how childish that previous viewpoint was. I don't
I don't
know.
know. I would say, look, my final thought.
Am I allowed to hate Field of Dreams and not be a total asshole? I think that's part of what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, of course. To me, that probably maybe half the audience feels more like that. But I think that understanding how pop art or mass fiction can become spiritualized is a window into how a lot of things operate that maybe operate on levels of respect that other members of the audience take for granted, but in which actually there are parallel workings at stake. By which I mean, saying that people need dreams doesn't negate the fact that people have different dreams, and so
Yeah.
different strokes, different folks. One thing on that note, I read a book on this subject called "Is This Heaven? The Magic of Field of Dreams" by Brett Mandel, and just one thing to just note is, for at least 10 or 15 years after the movie came out, and there's still relationships with it today involving baseball and TV, et cetera. But, people just started showing up at the field. The Terrence Mann thing,
Mm-hmm.
they'll part with their money because it's peace they want. They'll just show up. People actually did that after the film came out.
Like the
And
film became real in a way.
yeah, and people, they created real relationships on the field. Some people got married there. Some people went there after they lost their sons. Some people went there looking for their father and saw their father. I mean, the book's full of crazy stories that people have told about their relationship to the actual Field of Dreams, which is owned on this farm by this guy, Don Lansing, who, monetized it only to a point, never charged anyone for going there, kind of a thing, but would kind of sell buttons and stuff, and developed relationships. Couple things there. One is it's another show, and I won't say anything more, but the shrine like aspects of it, the sacred qualities of it, even prior to their commercialization by Major League Baseball, are worth investigating further. And there's you can find these stories in this book. But number two, one of the stories that I thought was completely crazy is uh, a woman loses her husband not long after seeing the movie, and a few years later, kind of has a dream that she's on the field, drinking a root beer and having a hot dog, and decides that she's going to go there on New Year's Eve, and like shows up, goes to Don Lansing's house, and is like, "Dude, can I just be out there on the field on New Year's Eve this year? I'm going to eat this hot dog, drink this root beer because I had a dream about it." And so he's like, "Yeah, okay." Seems like a pretty easygoing guy. The next day, she comes in. They have some coffee. They start up a correspondence by mail. Several years later, they get married. So the dream of the field led her to a partnership with the guy who owned the field. The guy was found, by a woman who was working for the production company in the town's tourism stuff back in '88. And so there are these kind of fantastical, spectacular, emotional, sentimental, real life stories that are now part of the legacy of the film. And so the final thing that I would just share on that is, it's interesting that authenticity is it's a cultural construction. It's a negotiation. It's something people have to agree on what the authentic is, because it's a performative thing. It's different for different people. It depends on a lot of stuff. This crazy schmaltzy Hallmark movie created a desire for people to make the film real in a way that very few films ever have. Maybe It's a Wonderful Life is the only other film that has that. Like, let's go to the bridge, which you can do up in upstate New York, purportedly the bridge. And I've been there, and I've been to that museum.
And it's a religious pilgrimage.
Right.
It really is.
It's how do you turn the profane into the sacred?
Yeah.
And even if you don't think it's universal, I would argue it's near universal. But even if you don't argue it's universal, it's a need that people have in secular societies and post-Christian societies, post-religious societies. It's a need people have. And so if that's a need they have, number one, be careful about constructing an ideology without God or without spirituality. And number two, it's going to express itself in any number of ways. One of those ways is film itself, which is, the kind of, the dream life of the collective unconscious. And so I think that that's just worth thinking about, even if you're anti-Field of Dreams.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I would end on, in terms of this secular religion thing and the need for that. I've been sort of fascinated. I met a new professor at law school this week, and he told us every one of these professors has begun with like telling us their life story, right? And because they're all like attorneys, local attorneys, judges. They're people that have done things in their lives, and they like to tell their stories. But what struck me about all of them, and this includes like the president of the school, etc., when they tell their stories, how often people, even like in the secular world of the law, are invoking dreams, synchronicities, weird, seemingly unexplained events that made connections for them in their lives and drove the biography. Like literally like, oh, well, I had a dream about Southern California and I Googled it when I woke up and I found a job here and it led me to that. Like, just all sorts of things. It's like there is, as much as like if I come up to someone on the bus and say, hey, man, I'm dreaming about this house I got to build, and I think I'm going to build it. People would be like, you might be schizophrenic, or they might think you're out of your mind. At the same time, I think everybody recognizes, and I mean, these movies, the popularity of movies like Field of Dreams, I think are in part like express exactly what you're saying, a longing for magic in the life and a belief in it, like a real faith in it. And it's just amazing to hear all these lawyers and judges being like, I'm here because of a dream, or I'm here because of some weird coincidence that happened that led me down an unexpected path. And that's how I became an attorney. It's just, we all have those stories. And I think we all need to believe in it one way or the other. It's really, really interesting to see how that mixes in with American politics and culture, because I think that I have a hint that like in the future, the academics that might be best at explaining the 2024 moment might be like the religious studies people who are sort of putting it in the like wider context of like American Christianity and all this weird sort of, I don't know what we call it, this sort of secular religious stuff. I mean, some people call it the New Age. Some people call it counterculture. But there are a lot of different entries, and it feels like it's so present in American life right now, and the connections to Trump are so insane. All right, Justin. Well, we had a good time. We didn't talk about Kevin Costner too much as an American figure. We can get back to him at some point. But this was fun.
Thank you. Yeah. Super well said.
We'll talk soon. Bye, everyone.